Hello, welcome to the Wilbur Series class on pruning trees and shrubs. First off, why do you want to prune trees or shrubs for that matter? Generally, the main reason is to maintain vigor, which you can do by removing dead, dying, or damaged wood, just to get that stuff out of there where some new growth can come in and take its place. Also, pruning will stop decay spread. If a limb's not properly pruned, you can get decay down in the trunk. You want to get that out of there so they can heal up properly, and also to get rid of diseases and insect problems that might be on your plants. Some other reasons why we would prune trees and shrubs is to get enhanced flowering and fruiting, which we do that a lot with our fruiting crops, which that is a separate type of pruning than we're going to talk about in today's video. To control plant size and form, to keep some of those trees and shrubs down in the landscape from overgrowing their locations. Also to rejuvenate old plants and to get some new growth in there and make the plant look really nice again. And then you want to prune it transplanting just to make the top of the plant match the root system, so you've got a balance, so to speak, between the root system and the top, so we can reduce the amount of transplant shock. Some other reasons is to thin your dense growth on a lot of these trees and things. If we can thin that growth out, we can reduce the amount of maybe wind damage or ice storm damage or anything like that. Also to direct the growth in the way that you want it to grow. Maybe a limb's growing over your house or into your house and you need to remove that limb. Also to remove growth that could be hazardous. This would be anything that maybe is damaged and might fall. So you want to go ahead and get that pruned out of there to get it out of your landscape. When to prune is one of the bigger questions I get here at the Extension office. And we do have a few rules on pruning beyond fruit trees. But for our landscape plants, we have a rule called the rule of June 1st. If you plant flowers before June 1st, you want to prune it immediately after flowering. So that means these plants bloom on old wood. So that wood has to go through a winter, and then that winter gets it to set a flower bud, and then it flowers in the spring. So plants in this group would be redbuds, dogwoods, rhododendrons, azaleas, those types of things. So you'd only prune those right after flowering in the spring, and then don't touch them again the rest of the season. Other plants that flower later than June 1st, you want to prune in late winter or early spring, because these plants bloom on new wood. So by pruning them in early spring or late winter or early spring, you're actually encouraging new growth, which will give you more flowers. And then we get down to our shade trees, which they're generally can be pruned in early spring or even late winter. We'll talk about these a little bit more in just a few minutes. So here's a list of plants that you would prune after flowering. I talked about just a minute ago, but we got redbuds or dogwoods, magnolias, crabapples, pears, plums, didzia, forsythia, hollies, honeysuckle, azaleas, rhododendron, lilacs, viburnum, and many, many others. So if just follow that rule and you'll know exactly when you need to prune these. So some of the late winter or early spring pruning plants will be butterfly bush, most of our clematis, hydrangeas, beauty bush, glauciobilia, and crepe myrtle. And then we come to our roses, and we'll talk about these more a little bit later because they have specific pruning times and requirements based on the type of roses that you're actually growing. And our shade trees, some of these actually can bleed excessively when spring pruned. It generally doesn't hurt the trees, but if you're worried about that, you may want to prune them a little later. Some of the ones that actually will bleed quite a bit are the birch, the elm, the pines, spruce, fir, and maples. If you've had some of those, you need to prune them. You may want to wait and prune those when they're in full leaf, and that's sometime around the 1st of June. As far as evergreens, generally any time for the leafy, unless they're growing for flower or fruit, then you'd follow the rules for your flowering plants. And then the pines are one that's very specific on pruning times. You will only prune these one time during the growing season, and that's when the new candles emerge and prior to the actual needle expansion for young new growth only is what this is. So whenever that candle comes out, that new growth, you can't trim all that off, because if you trim it all off, you're trimming the entire season's growth off, because they only grow out one time during the growing season. So you can cut that candle in half or even by a third or something like that, just just to kind of keep that plant shaped up and kind of keep it a little bit smaller and tighter than you'd want it. But do not prune off the entire seasons of growth because eventually you will kill this plant. Other tips for when to prune, to encourage rapid shoot development. You want to prune prior to spring growth. If you want to retard growth for dwarfing effect, then you can prune right after each growth flush, depending on the type of plant it is. And then never prune in late summer. That's a big problem because what happens is you'll get a new flush of growth and it won't get hardened off before it gets cold, and then the cold weather will come in and it'll kill it and burn it back. And that really damages your plant and really stresses that plant out for that the fall and during the winter. So closure or callousing, you can see here in this picture that we've got two different cuts there, two different locations. Usually the closing or callousing is most rapid after a spring flush. That's a lot of these why we want to prune them in the spring. Also, it's more aesthetically pleasing if you do the correct cut where it can actually callus and heal over. And then also insects decay and diseases are discouraged by getting proper callus or closure over that because we don't get decay down into that trunk. And then some other questions: when my tree bleeds to death, sap may leak from some of these trees pruned in late winter. That's really nothing to worry about. Most of us get a little bit worried about that, but generally the plants will not harm themselves. It's not harmful. For most of us, it's just we don't like seeing the bleeding, so it's better to wait and do it later into the growing season. So some other techniques we have here. We have heading back, which is selective cutting of terminal ends of twigs back to a side bud or a node, as in A there. You can see that we've just kind of trimmed back those larger branches back to where they are connected to the main branch to head them back. And this produces a dense shrub or a tree by increasing shoots lower down into the plant. Another technique is thinning. This is the complete removal of branches back to a lateral branch. As you can see in these pictures here, they're not great pictures, but you can see where they've basically just thinned a lot of those branches out, selectively pruned those all the way back to the main branch that came off of it and left a few just to thin those back. This gives the plant an open appearance, which allows airflow through, which really helps reduce disease problems. It also encourages new growth inside the crown. If that's something you're needing for that plant to grow new growth inside, if you thin some of that out away from the inside of the plant, you'll get some of that newer growth down inside. Here's another example of thinning. You can see this plant was never properly pruned. It was just allowed to grow into a large clump. And you can see in the first picture there, the top picture, that it's very full in the middle and it needs to be reduced down some because it's just too much going on there. So at the bottom, you can see where that larger branch that was in the middle, that was kind of not allowing for an open shape or some airflow, they just took that one all the way out down to the main trunk. And that way we've got a more a cleaner clumping plant here, and it's going to allow this plant to be a lot healthier down the road because it'll be less disease issues and probably less cracking and breaking in the long term. Here's another thinning out, not a great picture either, but you can see from the left there, this is a rose of sharing, how thick that is. And then on the right, you can see where they just went in and they trimmed out a lot of those smaller side branches and just opened up that plant to allow some more airflow through there. Some pruning techniques you can see there with these pruners that you want to cut there right at that branch collar, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit more. So where to cut when heading back or thinning, you want to always cut to an outward facing bud, and you can find the bud on the branch there. You want to cut at the proper distance from the bud, which is not too close, not too far, and then you want to cut at the right angle. And you can see there in that highlighted A there, which you're close to the bud but not cutting too far down below the bud there, like on the B, or leaving too much like on C, or getting even too close there and wrongly angled there on D. But A there is pretty much a 45-degree cut. So on pruning your shrubs, you want to remove all dead, diseased, and injured branches. You can do those anytime during the growing season. And then you want to remove all branches that cross or touch each other. So in that little photo there, you can see how much of that first pick there how much of that was just crossing and touching in there. And a lot of our landscape shrubs do that, especially if they are hedged or trimmed that way. They're just too thick. So they went in, thinned them out, and you can see the plant has a much better shape there by the following growing season. The goal of pruning, a properly pruned shrub is a work of art. It does not look as if it has been pruned. What we're working on here is trying to keep these plants into a natural shape that you would maybe see growing naturally in the wild. Pruning cuts should not be visible. That's another thing. You don't want to go in and make a huge cut, and that's the first thing you see when you look at the plant. They should be located inside the plant if at all possible, and then also covered by the remaining foliage once the plant leaves out. Another technique is rejuvenation of shrubs. This is a drastic method of pruning an old shrub that may have become too large or too leggy. A lot of our older lilacs have succumbed to this. This process can take 3 to 4 years. So if you have a large, say lilac or something like that, don't be discouraged. It's going to take a few years to get that into shape because you're going to take out some portions of that shrub each year for 3 or 4 years to get it back down to where it is manageable. Remember, you cannot take everything out at one time. So here's the steps to rejuvenation. You want to remove 1/3 of the old mature stems at ground level the first year. So you'll let everything grow. Then the second year, you're going to remove 1/2 of the old stems and head back the long shoots from the previous cuts. So that means you're just going to trim back the new things that grew from the old cut, and then you're going to take half the old ones out again. Then the third year, you're going to cut the remaining old wood and head back the long shoot. So by 3 years, you have taken all of the old overgrown wood out, and you should have a nice new rejuvenated shrub by then with new growth coming in. If you've got a leggy shrub, sometimes you may want to keep some shrubs from becoming leggy. If you use the rejuvenation method on a 3-year cycle, another way to do it would be to cut the tallest canes back to 3 inches. In the second spring, cut the next tallest canes back, and in the third spring, the remaining canes can be cut back. Same process basically as with the old overgrown shrubs. This is again the way you do it. That way, there's always foliage near the ground. So here's a hedge. You can see this hedge is properly trimmed because it is wider at the base than it is at the top. If you have it wider at the top than the base, then the base would become bare because it wouldn't get enough sun to keep the leaves actively growing. So always keep your hedge trimmed so it's wider at the base than at the top. Again, just repeating this again because people do not follow this and they end up with a bad looking hedge or shrub. The base of the hedge or shrub should always be wider than the top. Don't allow excessive growth between shears. Again, this if you let a foot or two of growth come in, you need to cut that back. Then you're completely defoliating this plant and you're stressing that plant, and then you're just not going to have a good look. So just remember, you may have to prune several times per year to keep your hedge looking nice and to keep it healthy. And then stop shearing 6 weeks before the first frost because you don't want a new flush of growth right before we get a hard freeze. Topping trees. Never, ever, 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 ever top a tree. For you all that are old like me or older like me, you remember Fred Wishy. Uh, Somebody asked him once about topping a tree, how far back to top it to, and he said about 2 inches above the ground. Uh, so that's about right. So basically, when you top these trees, it's pretty much a death sentence over time, and the tree is going to be unhealthy from now on. These cuts here can never heal up. So that's going to go down into that trunk and it's going to hollow that trunk out. You're also going to get water sprouts growing off that will break easy in windstorms and ice storms. So again, never top a tree. It's the worst thing you can do to the tree. If you're worried about the tree getting too big and may fall on the house, then just cut the tree down and plant something that's smaller. I know some of these pictures are a few years old, but a lot of people may know where some of these are. There's nothing about the homeowners or anybody else when I took these. I just wanted to get some examples of what not to do. These trees had been pruned several times or topped several times, and they just got weaker and weaker. I think probably most of these are already gone now. But just don't do this. Do not top your trees. It's the worst thing you can do. Now this is in town here, and you know that these homeowners have no choice here because this is growing under a power line, and you can see where they've made those cuts over and over and over in the same spots, and it almost has even kind of congealed into a pollard type of system, which is some of the cutting and pruning they do on trees in Europe to keep them really short, like 6 or 8 feet. But the, just keep in mind that if you plant a tree, what's above you, what's overhead, that eventually if it's going to grow into a power line, then the power company are going to come and cut it back. And it's just not a healthy situation. More topping, you can see in the left picture there that that's all the water sprouts that came out of that being topped there. All that's weak growth. It's going to slip off from wind and rain and ice and everything else. And on the right there's the same type of situation. All that new growth grows really fast. It's really weak and it breaks off really easily. Another reason that you want to pick the right plant for the right location. I know this is Main Street in Springfield, but wrong tree, wrong location. These trees are Japanese Zelkova, and they have held up well to being pruned excessively to keep them in bounds here. But Japanese Zelkova will grow 50 feet tall and 50 feet wide, so it just wasn't a good choice for Main Street. Maybe they were chosen because they can be kept pruned quite a bit, but that's a lot of maintenance that's just not needed because we can pick up the right tree for the right location, then we won't have to worry about all that maintenance. How about this one? This one's called bottoming. Um, it can be done right in the right circumstances, but you just take a few limbs a year until you get it where you want it. This plant was a large corner plant that was probably the wrong choice for the corner of the house. It's too close to the house. It's the wrong type of tree. It looks like a Norway spruce, which gets really big. It was just not good to put there to start with. And then they didn't keep it pruned down while it was small. So they decided to prune it up off the house. And then what you have now is something that's ridiculous looking. And this is probably going to break or snap off here in a one of the windstorms here because it's just top heavy. But again, just cut this down, plant something else there, and then go about your business because that's just ridiculous. And also, there should never be no narrow crotches that are less than 40 degrees. You can see there how close they are. Those are going to split. They don't have enough connective tissue. Crossing branches need to be pruned out. The water sprouts need to be pruned out, which talked about those water sprouts just a minute. And those are just things that are weak. They're going to cause detriment to the tree or to the shrub, and they're eventually going to break and fall out. You want to, when you begin pruning, you want to first prune out all dead, diseased, and broken branches. You can do that any time of the year. There's no specific time to do that, but that's just get that out of there. Next, you want to remove the fast-growing suckers at the base and along branches. Those are going to be usually your water sprouts. And this is best done on young trees. If you keep these things pruned and in check while they're young, you're going to have a healthier tree as they age. Here's some branch angles here. You think these can be saved? No. Um, the left one there or in the right one here, they had probably had the top broken out of the tree at some point. They had two buds that broke. They were close together and they grew up and they did not have enough branch angle away from each other. So they didn't have enough connective tissue when they grew out. So as they aged, they split off. The one on the left, the large portion of that split. The other side's going to split any day now. And then one on the right, it's just the main tree. The whole thing is going to come crashing down, and they should be just took out. Not sure how this one happened, but this is, I think, at Lexington Cemetery. You can see where at some point this tree had the top broken out. It grew two new tops. And somewhere along the line, it had maybe two branches that came out and could hit each other, and they kind of knitted together and then broke off, and it left this little connective tissue layer there, which is kind of interesting. Here's the problem with those branch angles or crotches not being correct. You can see on the left there, that is more of not quite a 90, but you can see maybe a 70-degree angle. And you can see that it's got a lot of good cambium tissue there, a lot of wood inside there that's all connected, and we don't have any just bark or cambium tissue holding it together. We've got old wood in there that's all connected all the way into the trunk of the tree. And you can see on the right there we have it's grown at more of a 45-degree angle, and we've got a lot of live bark, a lot of dead bark and rotten tissue all down in there that is connected, but it's keeping the actual wood from being connected all the way to the trunk of the tree or the main branch, and eventually that just gets weak as that branch grows. It gets heavy and then doesn't have enough wood there to hold the weight of it, and then it breaks off. As far as pruning or thinning crossing branches, you can do that. You've got to do that. You can see the top picture there. All those branches are crossed and really close together. If you were to leave that, that's going to cause you some wound problems, some dead branches, and a lot of other things later in that tree's life. So it's best to go ahead and get in there while they're small, get them out of there, let that tree heal that over, and then the tree will be just fine. But you've got to get that out of there because if you leave that in there, it's just going to cause you headaches as the tree gets old. And a lot of times a headache that's going to be detrimental to the life of the tree. Here we have water sprouts. More than likely what happened on the tree there was we had a bad ice storm. Those branches broke, and then the new growth, because we've got a lot of energy still stored in that root system, you can see that the new growth grew straight up. So we're going to have to go in there, and some of that that's growing straight up, we're going to take out and maybe head those back to maybe some outward facing buds to get that tree back into the shape that it needs to be. And on the right there, those are water sprouts at the base of the trunk of the tree. You want to go ahead and get those out of there before they get too big, because again, you're causing a multiple trunk tree, and it's not as healthy as it would be if it's a single strong trunk tree. So get those out and take those out while they're small all the way back to the main trunk of the tree. And I'll talk about a cut and where that cut should be made in just a minute. We've got crowded branches. You can see on the left there that maple tree there has got a lot of crowded branches in there. And if you look out towards the end of those branches, some of those smaller branches are already starting to die back. What they're doing is they're getting smothered out by larger branches on each side of them, and then you will end up with some dead tissue in that tree, some dead branches that will eventually have to rot out, and which will then decay down into the trunk of the tree, and eventually will kill that tree. On the right there, it's the same kind of situation. That's a ginkgo. Now, a lot of those ginkgos do grow in that base shape. But if you look closely, there's a couple of those branches you can see are already getting pushed in by branches on each side. Eventually, those branches will die. In the same scenario with the maple tree, it'll have to rot out or be cut out, but still that decay is going to get down on that trunk of that tree and eventually kill the tree. Once they get to this size, there's not a lot you can do with them, but go ahead and let them take their course. This is something that should have, or if it was a tree in your landscape when the tree was much younger, much smaller, that could have been pruned out and kept that from happening, and would have saved that tree, and those trees would have lived a lot longer life than they would otherwise. As far as removing large branches, that's anything larger than an inch and a half in diameter. Uh, for those, you want to do a first cut under the branch. This is going to keep this from pulling back the bark off the main trunk. So the first cut's under the branch, about a foot away from the trunk, until the saw starts to bind, which is, that's just a little cut into basically just cutting into the actual through the bark itself. The second cut should be on top of the branch, about 4 to 5 inches further out. And then the final cut is at the bark branch collar. And here we have just a natural target of pruning on your branches. Depending on, it doesn't have to necessarily be a conifer or a hardwood, but if you look there, you can see where we've got a branch collar. That's the main thing. We want to make sure that branch collar stays on the tree. You're going to make your first cut, just like we said, a little further out into just enough to cut that bark where it won't pull back. And then you're going to make the cut and cut it off, and then you're going to make your A to B cut there just above the branch collar. Here is the shoulder or bulge is formed at the base of a branch by the annual production of overlapping layer of branch and stem tissue. Basically, if you look there in the picture, we call it the branch collar. That's just the raised area next to where that branch meets the actual trunk. So your correct cut is just right at that branch collar, not further in or further out. The branch collar grows faster and will grow over that wound a lot faster if it's allowed to be cut close but not cut off, and that way that you'll get that covered over and sealed up before decay sets into the trunk. Also, you can see there on the branch bark ridge there, you can see that sticking up. That's just above there on the right. That's an area you make sure you stay out of that because that's an actively growing area too, which is usually right below that is where your branch collar is. So where to cut again? You want to make your final cut just outside the branch collar. Never flush cut. If you cut the branch collar off, it'll take a lot longer for that tree to heal over that, and then you will get some decay into that trunk. Here is a nice cut. This is one of the trees downtown. This cut was made at the proper location, right at the branch collar, and you can see how that branch collar grew right over that cut, sealed it shut, kept the decay out of the trunk of the tree. That's a perfect cut and a perfect healed wound. That's what it should look like after it's healed properly. Now, this was a cut that wasn't made correctly. They left the nub sticking up from the branch collar, and you see that that branch collar is not having a very good time healing over that. So it'll eventually heal over that, but the only way it's going to be able to heal over that is if that nub there gets rotted off. Now you could come in maybe and cut that out, cut that a little closer, and help that get healed over a little quicker. But at this point, you can see the insects are already in there. There's already decay starting down inside of that trunk of that tree. Here's your 3-point cut again. Basically just shows you where your cut should be made, your A, your B, and then your C. So basically A is just you're making a cut into the bark of the tree to cut that bark layer. Then B, you're just going to cut the branch off, and then C, you're going to come back and cut at the proper spot there, right at the branch collar. Some people ask about painting wounds. There was a time whenever the university, I guess, or even the public thought that we should paint the wounds. Now we recommend that you never paint any of the wounds that you've pruned. Anywhere you've got a wound on a tree that you've pruned a branch off, because what's happened, if you think about it, is the plant naturally bleeds just a little bit, just like we do if we're cut. That pushes bacteria and thing out of the tree. If you were to paint over that, whatever is on that wound then is stuck in that tree, and the tree has a harder time getting rid of those problems that would normally already be expelled from the cut. So don't put a pruning sealer on it. Just leave it be and let nature take its course. So basic tools for pruning: we need the bypass hand pruners, which you saw earlier in our picture. We need a pruning saw. Remember, a pruning saw cuts differently than a regular saw. It cuts on the pull stroke, which makes it a lot easier to do a good cut. And then we need our lopping shears, which are big lopping shears. We know, we'll show you a picture of those in just a minute. And that's basically all the tools you're going to need to do a home pruning. Now, if you're doing a major pruning process on a tree, a chainsaw or something may be involved, but I'd leave that to the professionals to do that if you've got that kind of pruning that needs to take place. So here's your tools. You see the handsaw there on the left, which if you open that up, it's got a curved blade on it and it cuts on the pull stroke. The next pictures there, we have our lopping shears or our hand pruners. Those are a must for most any kind of yard work as far as pruning back branches or deadheading flowers, anything like that. And then we have our larger lopping shears, which allows us to take out larger branches, maybe up to an inch or 2 inches in diameter. So I know that's a quick run through on pruning and what you might need. If you have any questions, you can always call me here at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. Happy gardening.